Hello, everybody, and welcome to yet another episode of Cybersecurity Hot Takes with me, Reece, the marketing person, and
HB. I do global sales engineering here.
And
I'm Jason Casey. I'm the CTO.
you think we'll get better at the and, but I kind of like that it's still a terrifying surprise. So, what's on my mind today, guys? Jason and I were just having a little chat recently, and he said something that was super easy to remember, and it's stayed in my mind, and I wanted our listeners to hear it. And it's about zero trust. The hot take for today is zero trust doesn't actually mean don't trust anything. And that was a lot of negatives, so just think about that really quick. So anyways, back to the little story. Jason said, if zero trust were aptly named, it would be the minimal axioms of security trust necessary to prove outcomes. And, that just stuck with me for obvious reasons. So, HB, what do you think of that hot take that Jason said?
My God, the first thing I thought was jinx. I think the last time when we were talking about some of this, the topic was whether security analogies were a good thing or not. And
that's right.
One of the topics that we sort of veered off to was that zero trust is a sort of hyperbolic sort of explanation of what people are genuinely doing when they talk about zero trust today. And from my standpoint, like you look at what Gartner was originally trying to sort of focus on and what Google was trying to do with their Beyond Corp paper, the idea of zero trust is really just to create a counterbalance and an alternative vision to like the perimeter security and castle and moat stuff that everyone's been doing for, as long as networks have been around. And so in my mind, what we've ended up at is that people kind of balance like least implicit trust, least over privileging, and least breach impact. And so those three things sort of, in my mind, define like a successful zero trust strategy for what it's worth.
Well, it's interesting because zero is a binary, right? It's zero or not zero, like 0 or 1. But least, that's more on a spectrum. So, where do we fit that into the reality of the zero trust situation?
I think again, like that's the hyperbolic part of it in my mind, at least, that is it really possible to get to genuine zero trust? Like if the idea is to move to maximum transactional trust and maximum kind of on-demand, just-in-time authentication and verification and least privileging and whatnot, it's hard to imagine a scenario where you're truly at zero, because then you've like really solved the problem. But again, like my perspective is probably drawn from sort of a pragmatic read of the space. Like I just think that like when you look at what people are doing, it sort of sits on this like continuum of I did nothing and I just called it zero trust to I tried a little bit to improve a couple of these things, and now
good enough
on my zero trust journey.
So I have a different take on zero trust. And I generally don't like the idea of greater or least or maximal because ultimately that implies that there's a continuum. And the reality, at least the way I think about zero trust, is you either trust something or you don't, right? And a zero trust framework, and the reason I had that kind of mathy statement is I do think it really boils down to like proving a thing. Like, how do I know a thing is true? And, all of our formal reasoning, right? Whether it's the logic we do in schools or the proofs that we go through in college to prove, theorems and whatnot, it always starts with a set of axioms, right? Or a set of assumptions that you assume to be true, right? I assume that if I connect 2 lines in a plane, it makes a line. If I connect 2 points in a line, if I connect 2 points in a plane, it makes a line. If I span 2 lines, it forms a plane. Like these are axioms of geometry, right? 2 parallel lines never cross. I can form an equilateral a triangle of equal sides by finding the center, by drawing a line, finding the center of 2 circles that have the radius of the line at the bottom, and essentially they'll form intersections for the other triangle. That's a theorem, right? It's a thing I can prove from the axioms, right? The 4 axioms that I started with. All proof systems, all formal systems, they start with things that you accept to be true, and they try and keep this as small as possible. And the reason they try and keep this as small as possible is because once you start building your system out, right, proving the implications of those assumptions, complex systems tend to collapse on themselves because you can very soon start to show contradictions. 1 equals 0. It's no different in a security world, right? So zero trust in a security setting is, I want to have some sort of a formal system that I can reason about whether I can trust a thing or not. If there's too many things that I have to trust in that formal system, then the formal system itself, it's not a question of whether it's less good or better or not good enough. It's more of a question of, is it sound, right? Are there things that I'm taking to be true that in fact are not actually true? I've enriched my system so much to where it just collapses in on itself, similar to...
What would the basic axioms of zero trust be? And I think you said keeping it simple is important because you need to have a foundation upon which to prove things. But the security ecosystem, it's all about defense in depth and integrating systems and increasing interoperability and visibility. So that to me kind of seems at odds with maintaining a minimal number of axioms. So what does that mean for practitioners?
So let's stop calling it axioms because we're probably losing half our audience every time we say the word axioms.
Axiom.
But let's say assumptions, assumptions we take for fact. I would say that no one is going to argue with the statement that you should have a minimal number of assumptions that you take for fact in a security architecture.
Yeah.
Right? That's probably not going to be controversial. What you were describing in my mind is much more of the outcomes of reasoning about a minimal set of systems. Okay. And it's no different in like good engineering design. Good engineering design isn't bespoke creations for every problem that shows up. It's recognizing that most problems can be broken down into a set of sub-problems, and you only need a couple of tools that are composable, that can be combined in different ways to solve these larger and more complex problems. So in the world of security, I think it's actually a valid question. Like if we were to try and take this as a more formal methods process, like what are the axioms of a zero trust architecture? What are the axioms of a design system? And then what is implied from that? And we already know the goals that we want the system to arrive at. So you could also maybe look at it as working backwards, right? But I think one of the core things that you have to adopt as an axiom is you have to adopt almost like, what manufacturers am I going to trust? And so the practical example of that is, we talk about at work TPM chips all the time. TPM chips, type of enclave. It's either on die in a processor or on a board in a modern computer. It lets software create crypto keys where those keys physically can't move, right? We are implicitly trusting the manufacturer of that TPM device to have followed the TPM spec. Like that is an assumption that we take for fact, that the manufacturer did exactly what the spec says and nothing else. If that assumption were to not be true, some of the consequences that we depend upon of using a TPM ecosystem also become not true, right? So what are some of the implications of that? Some of the implications are the TPM works in the way that the spec says. The manufacturer also protects the process. And so there's this thing called a root key, an endorsement key that actually lives on each of these TPMs that I can use to actually track back to the manufacturer. So when I'm trying to, let's say that I want a proof that is, in order to allow a device to connect to my network, I want it to prove that it has had an unmolested boot process, i.e. the bootloader, the BIOS, and the operating system are all OEM genuine and have not been modified in any particular way.
Yeah, no tampering.
With a TPM system, I can get a structural proof that gives me that. Now, at the core of it, I do have to trust a small number of TPM manufacturers, but there's one or two other things. But beyond those one or two other things I have to trust, I can actually use a protocol to kind of prove all the other implications and know for a fact whether I'm dealing with a tampered or a non-tampered instance of an operating system. Another example is kind of in the certificate system, right? Like in the X509 certificate system that we power HTTPS or most websites on, we do have a core root of trust, right? And it's essentially the root that our browsers use to trust CA roots, right? We basically assume that the CA, the organization that operates the CA, is following security practices, does not actually sign things with their root key, only signs things with intermediate keys, follows the appropriate practices, etc. And then we use that almost to bootstrap our proofs along the lines that, I am in fact talking to the website owner of name X, who controls the private key that is endorsed by this CA system, right? We don't have enough time to get into all of the mechanics of it, but we do have structural proof systems at work today. They're really minimal, and they definitely have gaps, i.e. things they don't cover, but they're consistent and they're correct, and they do provide really, really strong foundations for building a better security architecture.
So are you talking about like strict provenance assurance? Like are you suggesting that like zero trust is essentially like whatever comes like truly before the zero trust, and that's like the assured provenance? Like
no. So I'm recasting zero trust, right? So you can also say I refuse your reality and I choose to adopt my own, and that's fine. But I'm recasting zero trust in more of a structural sense, right? For my mind, being kind of like engineering focused and math focused, I want structural security protections, right? So a structural security protection is something that I can actually have a proof for, right? Like a mechanical proof. Whereas a non-structural security system is trust me, all of my people are good people, and you can look at my code, and surely if you can't spot the bug, there must not be a bug, right? We all kind of know the fallacy of that statement I just made, both from a practical sense as well as from a something called the halting problem sense. But a structural proof is much more along the lines of, I know a thing to be true because based on some sort of reasoning system with a very minimal set of core assumptions, I can prove it. That's really what I mean. Provenance in my mind would be a use case that you could use such a system to then prove that the chain of custody of this system and the chain of custody of this key or the chain of custody of this software has been with parties that I trust.
So would you feel okay if I changed it from least implicit trust to no implicit trust, no over-privileging, and no breach impact?
No.
No breach impact sounds weird, right?
Yeah, it's clearly this is a longer discussion, but it's I guess the reason why least implicit trust doesn't quite feel right is because that feels more like a property of a system, as opposed to making people really understand that there is a system, and the system has a core set of assumptions, and from those and it also has a set of reasoning primitives, right? Like and, or, negation, implies, and based on those assumptions and that reasoning, there's all sorts of consequential properties of a system. And then you can also look at it from a system design perspective, right? What are the properties that you want a system to necessarily have and nothing else, and kind of work backwards and then try and figure out what a system should actually be shaped by, right? If that makes sense. I apologize. Some of these things are a little bit harder to work into analogy, probably because I'm just not very good at it. But also I spent this morning actually reading some of the technical materials where they kind of shun the analogy and jump straight to the stuff. So switching between the two sometimes takes time.
Yeah, and you know how Phil Venables feels about analogies. We don't want to, incite another blog.
I guess still want to know what happened.
Yeah, we got to ask. I think the stuff that I'm really struggling to comprehend about this is a zero trust architecture is made up of many systems.
Yep.
And all of those systems have their own inherent assumptions that they operate off of. And some things are provable, like attestation within a TPM. But some stuff, is it possible to have things within a system that aren't provable?
Oh,
yes,
100%.
I think. And then does that mean it's a bad system, or is it just our systems like that sometimes?
So there's some very famous proofs that in logically consistent systems, there are true things that are in fact not provable. So
It's like faith. I'm just kidding.
you have hit on some deeply profound insights that were first discovered in the 40s or the 50s?
Time travel back.
there are absolutely things in systems that are unprovable. I think what people have to understand when they're thinking about systems and properties of systems is focusing on the right things to prove.
And with zero trust, if you had to pick 3 things, what would be those right things to prove?
Integrity of the hardware would be number 1. Integrity of the application stack all the way down to the bottom. And so what I mean by that, I didn't mean to make a Feynman reference, but now that I hear it out loud, I hear it. What I mean by that is in the TPM, you have this way of measuring software. And so you can actually measure the software integrity from BIOS to bootloader to OS to application. So when I say all the way down to the bottom, that's what I mean. So hardware integrity, application integrity. And this is where and so now we're getting to the edge of the industry. I would love to be able to include configuration integrity. That doesn't seem to exist just yet. At those 3 things, we actually start to solve a lot of kind of common problems that are exploited. Clearly, key integrity, although you limited me to 3, right? So, but with those first 3, what are the consequences of having those first 3 systems? I will always know, as both a resident on the system or a resident off the system, whether I'm dealing with a molested system or not. I will always know if a system is going to operate, what its configuration is, and nothing else, right? Now, again, doesn't mean there aren't bugs in the code, doesn't mean there aren't bugs in the hardware, right? So there are limits to things. But that's kind of a profound statement. Like, as a service provider, I know I'm talking to software I wrote as opposed to software that someone else is emulating, right? Mm-hmm. I know I'm talking to hardware that follows this particular spec and nothing else. Like those are kind of profound properties that have pretty far-reaching implications.
Would you add anything to that list of 3-4 things, HB?
As the dumb implementation guy, all I have to say is that getting any of those properties in systems broadly is super exciting, and that's a lot of what excites me about the way that our platform is being built. So I think we're in sort of the early renaissance of formal methods and formal verification and a broader range of critical systems. And I'm just glad that smarter people are working on these problems and solving them when I have a hard time fully comprehending them.
What a time to be alive, the Renaissance.
On that note, anyone listening is actually into formal systems. We're always up for hiring good people, and we actually do work like that in multiple areas of our product.
That's a good plug to end on. Jason, any particular roles right now?
Obviously all of our roles are generally software engineers. We are looking for product managers too. Cool. But we expect our product managers to be kind of technically trained, former engineers, or are deeply familiar with engineering problems. The types of problems that we work on that you almost have to be working on already. And we're just an opportunity for you to scratch that itch that you've had for a long time. So like language design, properties of language, properties of proving things about languages, but in real systems. Cryptographic protocols with certain interesting proof properties. But again, with an eye towards application and actually building them into real systems.
Nice.
Anyone who is into operating system development, driver development, again, with a deep understanding of how operating systems are composed, and then what does it mean to have a trusted operating system. Yeah, no, it's formal math has been around for a long time, but like practical application in industry I'd say is less than 5 years old, and we're still in the beginning.
Early Renaissance. Well, listeners, if you are that mythical technical being, please apply, but only if you like and subscribe first, and check out next week's episode. As always, we don't know what we're going to talk about, but we'll find out real soon.
We don't always know what we're talking about.
That's also true. That's an axiom. Excuse me, it's an assumption. We'll catch you all next week. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.